Have you ever had a really terrible DM? Somebody who made you not even want to play anymore? The Dungeon Master, or Game Master in non-D&D games, has a lot of power, and as Spider-Man taught us, with great power comes great responsibility. Just like a great DM can make a game, a terrible DM can ruin one. And today I want to talk about those terrible DMs. Hello friends, Ginny D here, and first things first, yes, this is a super clickbaity title, I'll own that, but until y'all start clicking on titles called 8 Ways to be a Good DM at the same rate that you click on titles like these, I'm gonna keep doing what YouTube demands from me. Besides, this kind of title lets me weasel my way onto your screen and then, surprise, here's some thoughtfulness and empathy, you sucker. When I say terrible DM, that's pretty harsh. And I want to be clear that I don't think everyone who does these things that I'm going to talk about in this video are like irredeemable monsters that should never run a game. My goal here is to talk about some of the things DMs do that can suck the fun out of their tables and sometimes even drive players away. And then I want to talk about why those things are such a problem and how they can be fixed. Because we're not about that negativity here. I want to correct the problem, not just complain about it. If you're a DM and you recognize some of yourself in this video, hopefully this can be a nice little gentle nudge towards things that you might want to work on. And if you're a player and you recognize your own DM in here, then maybe this will help you have the language to discuss it with them, or even just feel justified in not enjoying a game. Remember, we play D&D for fun, so if you're not having fun, you're allowed to stop and look for a group that you will actually enjoy playing with. All right, let's dive right in. The basic framework of a game like D&D is that the player controls their own character and the DM controls everything else. The rules are in place to make sure that everyone knows what they're allowed to do. But when the DM starts taking away the player's control over their own character, that can lead to a lot of tension. When I asked people about their worst experiences with DMs, some people told me about DMs that rolled their dice for them behind the DM screen, so they couldn't even see the numbers. I heard about DMs who just refused to let players take certain actions that should have been within the rules, or would forbid players from creating certain races or classes. Of course, DMs can set their own house rules as long as they communicate them clearly to their players. But when this kind of thing happens a lot, players can stop feeling like they're participating and instead start feeling like their DM is just telling them a story that they have no say in. To controlling DMs, I just want to remind you, if you want to tell a story where you get to make every decision, you can write a book. But when you choose to run a tabletop game, you're signing up for a collaborative storytelling experience. Your players need to feel like their decisions matter, or they'll stop caring about the game. I think the key to this is letting go of the idea that you can control where the plot goes. I know it can be hard to loosen your grip on the reins, but laying out a situation and then being curious and interested in what your players will do with it can be really fun, and your party might surprise you. Try to give them the opportunity to do that. At this point, the story of the DM giving their partner special treatment is so cliched that it's almost boring that it keeps happening, but I hear this story over and over and over. Or the DM has some kind of personal beef with a player, or isn't as friendly with one player and lets it influence what happens in the game. No matter the reason, no matter whether they're being extra strict or extra lenient, if the DM is treating their party unequally, people are gonna notice and it's gonna fester. DMs are a little bit like referees. They're the ultimate arbiter, and that means that if they favor or disfavor certain players, it's not just unfair or rude, it's actually gonna influence how the story unfolds. You don't want to play with a referee who has already picked the winning and losing teams. In the same way, it's no fun to play with a DM who can't be impartial. As someone who has DM'd for a group that includes my partner and who plays in 2 different groups that include the DM's partner, I can say with confidence that it is fully possible to treat players equally regardless of your relationship to them. If you're a DM who finds yourself falling into the trap of treating one player differently for any reason, I think your best bet is just to fall back on the rules and routines. D&D is structured for a reason, to facilitate smooth gameplay with a large group. You can rely on that structure to make sure that you're treating your players fairly. I remember when I first made my warlock pact. Behold!
Oh my god.
Who are you? A warlock Patreon. You mean a warlock patron? No, I am a warlock Patreon. You know, the membership platform, run by Kobold Press. What rewards does a membership include? Join me and you will receive early and even exclusive access to new 5th edition material. More than 24 pages of locations, lore, spells, monsters, character options, and more every month. Higher tiers even receive a bound hardcover book of the year's content. What I would give for such dark gifts. We recently hit a goal allowing us to create the Warlock Guide to the Plains, which will be available to $6 pledges and above. This guide will cover plains from the 11 Hells to the Storm Court, and will also include NPCs, magic, and more. How was I to resist such temptations? Dark Master, I wish to make my pact. What must I do? Spill my blood? Make a pilgrimage? A sacrifice? Merely visit patreon.com/koboldpress and choose your membership level, child. There is much I can teach you. Thank you, great and powerful Warlock Patreon. Thank you! When we roleplay, we're making ourselves vulnerable, and to no one more than the DM. We're putting our characters, our self-inserts, these fictional people that we are temporarily inhabiting, into the hands of another person. And we're trusting that person to not do anything that will harm us, mentally or emotionally. That's why it's a DM's responsibility to be conscious and cautious of where players' boundaries lie. This might mean that you don't throw giant spiders at your severely arachnophobic player. It might mean that you don't include adventures where children are endangered because you play with a parent for whom that stuff isn't any fun. It absolutely means that you have clear and frank discussions with your players up front about how much and what kind of sexual content they are okay with including in their games. There has been so much written and created on safety tools for tabletop gaming, and that could be a whole separate video, but I will leave it at this. Even if you mean well, even if you consider yourself to be a kind and empathetic and careful person, you should be using safety tools, period. You can't read your players' minds, and everyone is sensitive to different triggers, so err on the side of caution and make sure your players feel comfortable communicating their boundaries to you. DMs have a lot of power, that's kind of the job. And just like any position of power, it's super important that this power not be abused. One of the ways DMs wield power is secrecy. Players don't always know what a DM rolled, or how many monsters are lurking in the shadows, or what sort of magic items or special abilities an NPC or villain might have. This system works because players trust that their DM is going to use that secrecy honestly and in good faith. Now, many DMs fudge rolls or make adjustments to their plan to better suit what's playing out at the table, but if a DM is regularly lying about their rolls, inventing reasons that player actions don't succeed, and just generally moving the finish line continuously out of reach, that's an abuse of power. Also, DMs know everything about their players, their passive perception, their armor class, their resistances. But if a DM regularly builds scenarios specifically to avoid their players' strengths, that's shitty too. Your players are allowed to win sometimes. They're allowed to have a clever idea that pays off. It's not fair to ask that players follow the rules, but not demand the same thing from the DM. If there's a leader at the D&D table, it's the DM. That's a role that you accept when you sit behind the screen, and it comes with its own duties. If there's a problem player, it's the DM's job to handle it. If there's a conflict, the DM should be involved in resolving it. Now, I don't want to imply that players don't have any responsibility for their own interpersonal problems, but if players are clashing, or if someone is behaving poorly during sessions, having the DM's support can be incredibly helpful. I have heard way too many stories about people who were bullied or mocked or harassed by another player and got zero backup from their DM. That's the kind of thing that drives someone away from a game, or from D&D forever. When you run a game, you are taking some degree of responsibility for bringing that group of people together and guiding their interactions. So when someone is being unkind or disrespectful or inappropriate at your table, you need to treat that as your problem. If there's one thing I've learned from talking about D&D on the internet, it's that everyone plays this game differently. That's one of the things I love so much about D&D, but it's also one of the main areas where a campaign can go horribly wrong. If you're running a grimdark strategy combat game and your players want a roleplay-heavy, backstory-focused adventure, no one is gonna have a good time. That doesn't mean DMs have to run the kind of game other people want, or that players need to want to play the same kind of game a DM wants. All it means is that it's super important that both the DM and the player players agree on what kind of game they're playing. Should characters be at real risk of dying? How much combat does everyone want to do? How much roleplay? Is it gonna get emotional? Is there gonna be romance? Is there gonna be mystery? You can run any kind of game you want, but everybody will have more fun if you're all very clear about what that means from the very beginning. I get it, it can be hard to hear criticism. I don't think anybody actually likes being told that they're doing something that somebody doesn't like. But if you aren't willing to hear what is and isn't working for your players, they might just leave instead. A great first step is to just ask. At the end of your sessions, ask your players to tell you both what they liked about the session and what they didn't like. But remember, a lot of people say they want feedback but still get upset when they receive it. So step 2 is to make sure your players feel comfortable critiquing you. One way you can break the ice is by bringing up something that you were unsatisfied with. Maybe you felt like combat started to drag, or you admit that the NPC you came up with on the fly had weak motivations. It's super important that when your players do give you feedback, you respond well to it. Thank them for being honest with you. Ask clarifying questions to make sure that you fully understand what they're saying. And most importantly, implement that feedback. You don't have to accept every critique that your players give you. Sometimes people give bad critique, that happens. But if your players are unhappy with something and they don't feel comfortable telling you about it, the only possible outcome is that they grow resentful over it and maybe even eventually leave. It's part of the DM's job to play villains, to play monsters, to embody the roles of the party's enemies. But just because the DM is the character's enemy doesn't mean they have to be the player's enemy. The DM's goal shouldn't be to defeat their players. It should be to create a game that everyone enjoys. And that includes being a challenging opponent, of course, but it doesn't include being an asshole. No matter how cruel their NPCs might be to their players' characters, the DM should never be cruel to their players. Nearly everything on this list can be solved with a good, thoughtful session 0 and the use of safety tools. You don't even have to come up with all this stuff on your own. So many people have provided guidance on how to create a gaming table where everyone feels safe and comfortable, even while their characters are in mortal danger. I'll link to a few good resources in the description. As my friend Lizard recently said to me, life is short and D&D is long. Most people don't have a spare 5 hours a week kicking around to dedicate to something that makes them miserable. The only reason we all make time for role-playing games is because we love them. So if you're stuck with a DM who makes gaming suck for you, this is me giving you permission to just quit that game and find one that makes you happy. And if you're the DM who might be driving players away, this is your opportunity to learn something and grow as a game master. Speaking of mortal danger, if your party needs a healer, remember that there is just 1 week left to pledge $5 or more on my Patreon and get a postcard in the mail with my field medic Ellie's complete stat block so you can drop her right into your own game. I'll put that link into the description, and I will see you next week for a brand new music video. If you want to hang out, at least hang out on camera where they can see you. You're so cute. But I am the only witness. You're gonna have to stay put though. Like, if we're gonna hang, we gotta hang long term. This is a long video. Figure it out. Are you gonna sit with me or are you gonna leave? Make a call, make a decision. Just gonna put your butt right in my face.